Well, it's been a while since I last circled back around to the Assault Suit series, or Target Earth or Cybernator, depending on which version you stumbled into first. For those who aren't familiar, all of those titles are connected. They belong to the same overarching series. Target Earth is actually the Western name for Assault Suit Leynos, while Cybernator is the localized title for Assault Suit Valken. Fortunately, both had re-releases, but Leynos was more of a remake, while Valken received a straight-up re-release in the form of Assault Suit Valken Declassified on the Switch. A pretty solid release that brought the series back into the spotlight just for a little bit. That said, it had already seen a visual overhaul years prior on the PlayStation 2, though only in Japan and Europe. So, are there differences between the original versions? A bit. Minor tweaks were made to certain death scenes in the Western release, likely to avoid ruffling any feathers among American players back in the early 90s. That includes a horrific scene of a comrade burning up in the atmosphere in the original game, and one including self-deletion in Valken. Still, back in 1990 or 1992, the idea of a story in a video game was novel enough that most players were just grateful it was there at all, let alone concerned with whether or not content had been edited or trimmed for localization. Unfortunately, the series didn't get much of a foothold outside of Japan after that. Luckily, due to the Sega Saturn's underwhelming performance in North America, developer NCS, or probably more specifically their publisher Messiah Games, choose not to take the risk of localizing Assault Suit Leynos 2 for Western audiences. It's one of many Saturn titles that never made the jump, now forming part of that wistful backlog of games we Saturn diehards still daydream about. Right up there with other mech-focused releases like Gun Griffin 2 and the original Sakura Wars titles. And really, that's just scratching the surface when it comes to what we missed out on. As for Valken, it did get a follow-up of sorts, an RTS-style sequel on the PlayStation, which, being far more commercially successful, could have been a good platform to revive interest, but again, that never made it overseas either. Of course, before I get too deep into things, I'd like to give a quick thanks to Clear River Games and City Connection for providing me with a review key for the Nintendo Switch version. As always, there was no obligation to share any particular opinion, and no money changed hands in exchange for coverage. What you're hearing from me is entirely my own take, flaws and all. That said, this one was a no-brainer. I've had my eye on it for a while now, and the moment I heard it was finally being re-released and properly translated, I knew it'd end up on the channel eventually anyhow. So with all that out of the way, let's get into this rather classically structured review of Assault Suit Leynos 2, the Saturn Tribute. Before I get too deep into my thoughts on the story, it's important to remember that in 1997, narrative still wasn't the primary selling point of an action platformer. Most of the time, a game plot was just an extra layer, something that might enhance the experience if the gameplay was solid. That said, Leynos, Target Earth if you prefer, launched in 1990 with a surprisingly competent and compelling story. It did something most side-scrolling shooters on home consoles didn't even try to do until years later. At a time when bringing the arcade experience into the living room was still very much the central mission of the Sega Genesis, Valken, released 2 years later in 1992, wasn't quite as innovative simply because Leynos had already set a precedent, but it absolutely wasn't an afterthought either. Its story had genuine stakes, a tone of urgency, and a willingness to let things end in tragedy. So forgive me when I say Leynos 2 feels like a massive letdown in comparison. To put it plainly, this game's central storyline is completely pointless. The only thing that matters is what's in the manual. It's stitched together with every shallow military cliché imaginable. Uninspired is the nicest way I can describe it. Generic is probably more accurate. Sure, it was 1997, but by that point a lot of games were already experimenting with more ambitious storytelling, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Leynos 2 is absolutely the latter. Except it's a story that's not so bad it's good, it's just dull. You play as Kyle, the lead grunt in the 12th SAS team, basically a band of wisecracking mercenaries who all feel like the same person speaking, but with different portrait art. Individually, they have names like Eddie, Dolph, and Maria, but collectively, they all blur together. It's like someone took a handful of side characters from a better game and accidentally made them the protagonists. Gone is the desperate, tension-filled atmosphere of the original games. The tone of Leynos 2 is more Saturday morning military power fantasy than bleak war story. And in one of its final scenes, the game even manages to undercut one of the most memorable and emotional moments from the original Leynos, almost as if it's trying to spite it. The entire experience clocks in at barely over an hour, at least with the first playthrough, even if you're not especially good at the game. In that short runtime, you'll learn absolutely nothing meaningful about what's going on. The enemies are just faceless cannon fodder, and the protagonist couldn't care less about the conflict. There is a brief rival who shows up during an arena section and then comes back later on, because of course there's always an arena section. Then, near the end, a final boss character appears out of nowhere with zero build-up. He's the leader of the enemy force, but you get no backstory, no motive, not even a name that sticks. He's just bad. He's somehow less developed than the final boss and Metalhead on the 32X, and that's saying something.
Enough foul play. Let's get down to it.
All the while, your squad continues tossing out lines about wanting cash or looking forward to drinks after the job's done. There's no investment in the mission, no emotional stakes. They're just going through the motions, and because of that, so are you. Honestly, when I played Leynos 2 back in the day without understanding the language, I thought maybe I was missing something more profound, or at least a little more interesting. Turns out, I wasn't. The language barrier spared me from realizing just how hollow this part of the game really is. Thankfully, everything gets better the moment you stop thinking about the storyline, or dreading yet another text dump packed with recycled military slang and empty posturing. Once the narrative fades into the background, Leynos 2 reveals its strongest asset, the gameplay. And not just decent gameplay, it's sharp, responsive, and surprisingly deep. It's the kind of game that knows exactly what kind of mechanical experience it wants to offer and mostly nails it. That said, it also has an overly generous auto-aim system. You're given full, deliberate control over every primary function of your assault suit. Your arms move independently of your legs, allowing you to aim in any direction your joints can manage, which makes movement and combat feel fluid but grounded. Whatever weapon you've got equipped, aside from the opening stage, is something you've unlocked yourself and personally chosen for a mission, one of many you unlock over several playthroughs. You can whip out a shield mid-movement to block incoming fire, dash through small encounters to preserve your limited ammo, or strategically boost over ledges in uneven terrain. The sense of weight and feedback is consistent throughout, selling the fantasy of being inside a powerful and agile finely tuned war machine. Even better, you return to space here, something the original Leynos fans will appreciate. Unlike the punishing space stages from the first game, which seemed built to kill you as often as they were to impress you, Leynos 2 goes for something a little more manageable. You can even lock your aim in place now, letting you nail those Contra-style diagonal shots without wrestling the D-pad. It's a great feature, one that offers a bit of finesse to the game's movement combat loop. But there's also a flaw. You don't really need it. Most enemies just don't push you hard enough to require clever positioning or careful aim. Add the toggleable auto-aim feature available from the start, and suddenly most of the tension just evaporates. You can leave it on the entire game and barely have to lift a finger in terms of tactical thinking, especially on repeated playthroughs. The original Leynos featured loadout customization and options that, while admittedly simple by today's standards, were pretty groundbreaking for 1990. It was one of the first home console shooters that gave the player any real say over their arsenal, something that really made it feel a step ahead of its peers. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Leynos 2 is wildly original in that regard, especially given that it was released in 1997, at a time when plenty of mech games, and even some platformers, were experimenting with similar ideas. But what I will say is that it offers a surprising amount of depth for a 2D action shooter of its time, especially compared to the few, often Japan-only titles that tried anything remotely similar. There's a solid variety of equipment to mess around with, and a good number of assault suits to unlock. You can even unlock the Valkyrie by completing all arena encounters. I did unlock it, but not without a certain issue popping up. I'll get more into that in a moment. Each suit has its own stats, and you'll be able to tweak a few key values to customize your experience: weapon power, mobility, and repair. Weapon power, interestingly, doesn't directly increase damage. It's a pool that dictates how many and which weapons can be equipped based on their individual power level and your suit's carrying capacity. It's less about brute force and more about loadout strategy. Mobility affects your dash speed rather than your base walking speed. so don't expect to zoom across the map unless you spec accordingly. And repair dictates how quickly your suit auto heals when standing still. On top of the base stats, you can equip armor that defends against 3 types of damage, labeled A, B, and C. What do those actually mean? The game really never goes out of its way to explain the specifics. Leynos 2 was still part of an age when manuals existed and mattered, so all of that information was put there. Thankfully, the brains behind this Saturn Tribute went out of their way to include a fully translated manual as well, which, if I'm to be honest, was a lifesaver when it came to understanding the wider mechanics of this game. You also get access to modules, little augments that provide stat bonuses or additional functionality. Some give a modest boost to repair speed or power output, while others enhance things like auto-aim, making an already easy system even more forgiving. Sometimes their exact functions are a little vague though. All of this, suits, weapons, modules, is locked behind a ranking system, meaning you're not likely to see everything the game has to offer on a single run. Thankfully, Leynos 2 does not make you start from zero every time. Progress carries over multiple playthroughs, allowing you to gradually build up your arsenal and access a full range of customizable options. Initially, I had planned to end my review right when the game ended, but something just kept nagging at me. I wanted to understand why this game had such a strong following in Japan. On the surface, it didn't make much sense at first. The game's short, the story is completely forgettable, the characters have absolutely no presence or memorable traits to speak of. Nothing about that part of the experience really stood out. But I still felt like I was missing something, so out of curiosity, and because I hadn't unlocked all that much on my first run, I went back in. I started pushing for higher ranks, trying to get a better feel for how much more there was to uncover, and to my surprise, things came together almost immediately. That second playthrough was infinitely better. So was the third. Sure, it was quicker, now that I had a general grasp on enemy placements and stage flow, but the satisfaction came from tearing through each mission faster, cleaner, trying to beat stages in under a minute, grabbing higher ranks, and unlocking entire new sets of weapons, modules, armors, and suits. That's when the real appeal of Leynos 2 revealed itself. It wasn't about the narrative, or even the levels themselves. It was about mastering the game. The draw was in the progression, the experimentation, the constant reward loop of becoming more efficient and unlocking more toys to play with. That's the part that stuck with people. That's the part that made it a cult hit. Being a re-release, there is a few extras added in, mostly in the form of quality of life improvements. Some of the optional settings help streamline gameplay by tweaking stat recharges or giving small boosts to mobility and repair speed. None of it feels like cheating, and there's nothing really egregious like a full-on god mode to ruin the experience. It's subtle help, and it's entirely optional. You also get your usual retro release options, anti-aliasing toggles, screen scaling, background plate swaps. Pretty standard stuff by today's standards, but it's always nice when developers give players a little room to tweak the progression. There's also a modest weapon database, a few tips buried in the pause menu, and some light control customization. Nothing groundbreaking, but enough to suggest someone cared about making this version feel complete, rather than just slapping it onto modern hardware and calling it a day. Now, I do have to mention the rewind feature, which basically works by constantly generating save states that you can scroll through and snap back to at any moment. On paper, it's a great addition. In practice, it was a bit of a disaster for me. I was using it pretty shamelessly, I'll admit, to push through the arena and unlock the Valken, but somewhere along the way, it glitched. I triggered an error that crashed my Switch. When I booted the game back up, everything after my second playthrough had vanished, just gone. It must have corrupted the save data or overwritten it, but the end result was the same. All that progress, all those unlocks, wiped clean. I have no idea what caused it, and I haven't been able to replicate it since, thankfully, but it definitely soured the moment. Still, I powered through the game many times. Though, note, the Valken sucks in this game. The reality of playing a Sega Saturn re-release in 2025 is that, well, there's no mistaking where it came from. It's got that unmistakable Saturn aesthetic, that oddly specific flavor of mid-90s visual design that no other system could really replicate. If you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of the Sega Saturn. Unless you're dealing with a one-to-one port of something ultra-generic, RoboPit comes to mind, you can always tell when a game was born on that faded hardware. Leynos 2 is no exception. It wears its Saturn roots proudly, and every frame of animation, every bit of visual fidelity screams 2D Saturn showcase. Imagine a Super Nintendo era action shooter, only supercharged in all the ways you hoped the next generation of 2D games would eventually evolve. It's packed with detail, brought to life with a distinct art direction that feels both deliberate and incredibly passionate. Everything is drawn with a sense of weight and mechanical personality, and the screen is constantly lit up with those weird little flourishes that you didn't know you wanted until they actually appeared. Sparks flaring from boosters, shrapnel tumbling off screen, these are the things that made Leynos 2 look and feel like a proper step forward in 2D game design, rather than something simply caught between generations. There's this unshakable feeling that you're playing something at the crossroads of arcade and console gaming, a rare moment when those two spaces collided in just the right way. A lot of games from this era tried to hit that sweet spot with varying degrees of success, but Leynos 2, it really does nail it. It's that perfect middle ground where visual flair, tight controls, and a deliberate sense of design all sort of come together. Something that feels purpose-built for the hardware, not just squeezed into it. Of course, just to confirm it, Leynos 2 happens to have all the unique and lively flair that the original Leynos 2 brought as well. Levels are still technically A to B affairs, but there's a lot of things going on around you. Your assault suit isn't the only one fighting, and it still carries that sense of grand scale conflict that made the original stand out. To get a better feel for the music in Leynos 2, I played through the game a few more times just to see what stuck. Honestly, because of how fast and focused the gameplay is, it's easy to tune the soundtrack out. But once I started paying attention, I noticed it actually fits the tone and pacing of the game pretty well. Most of the tracks go for a gritty, rock-inspired sound, lots of MIDI-driven energy that kind of channels the Genesis-era vibe. It's not super emotional or atmospheric, but it definitely feels like it belongs. From what I found, the music was handled by Cube, with composers like Noboru Iwata, Hiroaki Shibata, and Hiroshi Iyazuki involved. They worked on a ton of projects over the years, and you can tell they knew exactly what kind of sound would match a game like this. Interestingly, while the game mostly uses MIDI, the original Saturn disc could actually be played in a CD player to listen to the music, which makes me think the whole retro sound was pretty intentional, as in the MIDI tracks were likely pre-recorded and exported as music tracks in order to use the Saturn's CD audio capabilities. The real standout though is the ending theme, performed by, and I'm gonna massacre this name, Shizuka Arai, who's also done voice work in Disgaea, The Printing Games, and Phantom Brave, The Lost Hero, though at the time she went by the name Shizuka Hojo. It's got that classic 90s vibe to it, which instantly wins me over every time. It feels almost like the reward for making it to the end, and it's one of those few times the music really steps forward and leaves a lasting impression. So yeah, while the soundtrack isn't front and center, it's solid, it does the job, keeps the momentum up, and it ends on a really high note. For me, Leynos 2 is something I'd been wanting to get my hands on for a very long time, and realizing it was designed to be replayed and mastered made it all the more satisfying. Sure, the story is completely forgettable, but honestly, that didn't matter. I was having fun running missions, unlocking better gear, and just getting better at the game. At some point, something clicked, and I found myself back in that old mindset of just playing something because it's fun. No pressure, just enjoyment. Do I wish there were more stages? Absolutely. This game came out in 1987, and any hopes of additional content are way behind us. Still, diving into an assault suit game again had me wondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you be interested in a full retrospective or a series of videos on the assault suit games now that I've gotten better at them? Let me know in the comments below. As always, like the video if you liked it, and if you've enjoyed this at all, consider subscribing for more. I've been Kei-Nova, and I'll see you in the next one.